Israel has always been a key factor in the US-Iran relationship, and a key reason as to why the US and Iran have not been able to strike a deal that would resolve the key elements of their tensions. From the Israeli standpoint, a deal between the United States and Iran would dramatically shift the balance of power in the region against Israeli interests. But in the current US-Iran negotiations, Israel has gained a particularly potent role in being able to sabotage any agreement because of the Iranian insistence that any ceasefire has to be region-wide and include Israel, and particularly its bombardment of Hezbollah and Lebanon. The Iranians have three key reasons as to why they are insisting that any ceasefire has to be region-wide and encompass Lebanon as well. First, there is a narrative in Lebanon that Iran abandoned the Lebanese in 2024. The Iranians are very adamant about making sure that nothing is done in this deal that further fuels that narrative, and they feel that they need to restore their standing within the constituents of the so-called axis of resistance. Secondly, any warfare by Israel in Lebanon or in Gaza risks spilling over into yet another confrontation between Iran and Israel. In fact, the war in Gaza and in Lebanon has already twice spilled over into a direct Israeli-Iranian confrontation. And mindful of the fact that the Iranians are adamant about making sure that this is not just a ceasefire, but something that actually establishes an end to the war, they cannot afford that the Israelis continue their warfare in Lebanon, mindful of the risk that it carries when it comes to spilling over into further warfare between the Israelis and the Iranians. But perhaps the most consequential way in which Lebanon and Israel matter in this negotiation right now is because it reveals so much about Washington itself. If the American side cannot or is unwilling to restrain Israel and put that pressure on them so that they cease their bombardment of Lebanon, then the question Tehran asks itself is, what is the value of any agreement with the United States? Because if the United States cannot rein in the Israelis and continued warfare in Lebanon spills over into Iran, and the United States cannot resist supporting Israel in that war, then again, what is the value of a ceasefire? For the ceasefire to be durable, it has to then, as a result, also include the Israelis. And if the United States is incapable or unwilling to deliver on the Israeli end of the bargain, then perhaps a deal is not worth striking in the first place, particularly mindful of the nuclear concessions that the Iranians would have to give in such an agreement. Now, Trump could, of course, repeat what Ronald Reagan did with Menachem Begin in 1982, in which he was infuriated by what the Israelis were doing in Lebanon at the time and threatened to withdraw support to Israel if the Israelis did not pull back. It took 20 minutes and Begin called back and announced that he had ordered the withdrawal from southern Lebanon. It was a clear sign that when the United States exerts pressure on Israel, Israel has no choice but to comply. The question has always been whether American presidents are willing to exercise that leverage over Israel. But a more plausible scenario may be one that is murkier and in some ways more dangerous. The United States and Iran come to an agreement. The United States puts pressure on Israel to withdraw from Lebanon. The Israelis comply, at least for the moment. But over time, the Israelis manage to find ways to extradite themselves from the agreement and restart the bombardment of Lebanon under the guise of self-defense. At that point, Tehran would face a difficult dilemma. It would most certainly try to put pressure on Trump to make sure that the Israelis were reined in. And it may even threaten to withdraw from the agreement altogether if Trump does not follow through. But if Washington fails to act, would the Iranians really sacrifice sanctions relief, economic recovery, and an end to open warfare simply to register their objections? Moreover, walking away may not compel Trump to put pressure on the Israelis anyways. Iran may end up in a scenario in which it has neither sanctions relief nor an end to the fighting in Lebanon. In fact, it would probably be a scenario that the Israelis would welcome. One option that the Iranians are considering is perhaps even more ominous, which is to stay within the agreement but extract another cost from the United States and Israel elsewhere, particularly through retaliation against the United Arab Emirates, a close strategic ally of Israel. The logic of this UAE for Lebanon option is brutally simple. If the broader US-Iran agreement tolerates Israel attacking an Iranian ally in Lebanon, then Tehran argues that the agreement should also then be able to tolerate Iran attacking an Israeli ally in the Persian Gulf. In this scenario, the Iranians would attack the UAE or target Israeli operatives in the UAE for every attack that Israel conducts against Lebanon. Rather than collapsing the agreement altogether, Tehran would instead try to exact a cost from Israel for its non-compliance. Such a strategy would nevertheless be quite risky. The Emirates would very likely retaliate and try to widen the conflict. But it remains unclear whether the United States would actually rush to the UAE's defense, knowing very well that it could collapse the entire agreement that it has between the United States and Iran. In that sense, the strategy would put the burden back at the feet of the United States. Either restrain Israel or watch the conflict metastasize across the Persian Gulf and the entire Middle East. The implications for the rest of the Gulf Cooperation countries would be profound. There's very little love for the UAE in the region right now, but at the same time, none of the countries in the GCC want to see another destabilizing conflict. Moreover, condemning Iran's attacks against the UAE would put further spotlight on the fact that these states have done very little to prevent Israel from attacking Lebanon, and far less condemnation of what the Israelis are doing in Lebanon. Hopefully, none of this comes to pass. A deal between the United States and Iran, backed by the majority of regional states, is still a possibility. Trump could still decide that preserving regional stability, which is a core US interest, requires Israel to respect the terms of the broader ceasefire. But the very fact that Tehran is contemplating escalation against the UAE if Israel bombs Lebanon reveals how the UAE has made itself an unnecessary target in the Israeli-Iranian rivalry simply by signing the Abraham Accords.